Well, happy Holy Monday. Uh, so, this is the first day of our Holy Week celebration, and I wanted to talk about worship and just some aspects of it. And I want to distinguish worship from music. And, um, a lot of times we get worship bound up in a box. And I want to take that out. And I was thinking about that in terms of worship and Holy Week and how it was part of the original celebration. And after Jesus instituted communion, and we see that in the scriptures. So when Jesus institutes communion and he teaches that to the disciples there at the Last Supper, the Bible tells us that they worshiped, they sang a hymn. And I wanted to read that. It's in Matthew 26:30, and it simply says, after they sang a hymn, they went to the Mount of Olives. So I was reading that, and I was thinking, could Jesus carry a tune? We don't actually know that. We don't know if he was a good singer or a poor singer. There are things the Bible doesn't just always tell us about the Lord. I don't know that it matters, but it's something to think about. We know that he was tempted in like manner as us, and so it could be that might have been one of the fleshly or earthly trials that the Lord chose to carry while on this earth. But we know this: Jesus was a paradox. He was often different than what people expected. In fact, he was everything people expected him not to be most of the time. And so, it's just fun for me to think about that. Maybe Jesus couldn't carry a tune. Maybe he didn't sing that well because he was a paradox. He chose to be a paradox. He was. When we look at Scripture, he was often remarkably average. Everything people didn't expect him to be. Lowly. He was humble. He was average looking. He was poor. He was homeless. He was all these things that people thought the Lord shouldn't be. Well, we don't know. He may have sang beautifully. But I like to think about it. I wonder about that because, in my own lifetime, I haven't always been a very good singer, and in fact, I used to get teased about it when I was growing up. I grew up in a very musically gifted family, and I just really didn't always carry a tune. I seemed to have my own special little key most of the time, and what I'm telling you is, if that's you, don't let it stop you from worship. Don't let it stop you from singing. And I used to think of people as the worship police. You'd be singing and loving the Lord and having a good time in His Spirit, and someone would get nitpicky about how you're doing a song. It'd be the worship police, and it used to bother me. And we know Jesus had opinions about worship, whether he could sing or not. We see an account in the scriptures where he encountered a woman who talked about the worship police, and I want to read that scripture. It's in John 4 where he meets the woman at the well in Samaria, and I want to start with verse 19, read through verse 24. The woman said to Jesus, I see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that people must worship in Jerusalem. Jesus told her, believe me, a time is coming when you Samaritans won't be worshiping the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You don't know what you're worshiping. We Jews know what we're worshiping because salvation comes from the Jews. Indeed, the time is coming, and it is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for people like that to worship Him. God is a spirit, Those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The first thing we see there is that the Samaritan, the woman of the well, was dealing with the worship police. And we notice that. And she starts quoting the Samaritan worship police. And she says, the Samaritan worship police say we should worship here. But the Jewish worship police say we should worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, it doesn't matter what the worship police say. God is seeking people who will worship him in spirit and in truth. This is the only qualifier Jesus puts on worship while he's walking on the earth. And I find that fascinating. This Holy Week, we need to be people of worship. We don't have to be people of talent to be people of worship. And we need to think of that. And I know what I'm talking about. I like I said, I haven't always sang very well, and yet I keep worshiping. You don't have to be the best. You don't have to be talented. You don't have to have a beautiful voice to be sincere and true in worship. And worship isn't about music. Worship is about the Lord. Worship isn't about gifting or talents. Worship is about recognizing the actual worth of God. And to sing with joy. And, the Lord told us to make a joyful noise. And I think the worship police like to take the joy out of my noise sometimes. And I want to have a joyful noise. So I'm encouraging you, no matter who you are, or how you think you sing, or what mistakes you think you make, worship with a joyful heart this Holy Week. God once asked me, in fact, there are a lot of times that get to me, the worship police would get the best of me, I guess. It's really my fault. And I was home alone one day, and everybody's gone, and I went out on the front porch, and I was just sitting there watching the dogs play in the yard and that kind of stuff. And the Lord spoke to me, and he said, Charles, why don't you sing to me anymore? And my answer, and I hadn't been, to be honest, I was just kind of letting everybody else do all that for me. And I said to the Lord, I can't sing. And he said, did I ever tell you that? Have I ever told you that you did it wrong? Or that your worship wasn't good enough? You need to sing to me. And with that, the Lord stirred something in my soul and began to change my approach. And I began to worship the Lord. In fact, my dad had an old saying, he used to say, get your harp down out of the willow, son. And it comes out of that psalm where the Hebrews say, crossing the river, going into captivity. And they said, we hung our harps in the willow because we couldn't sing the songs of Zion in a strange land. Well, I think that's a good place to sing the songs of the Lord. But when my dad said that, he said, get your harp down out of the willow, son, it usually meant that I had my mandolin or guitar hidden away in a closet and hadn't been playing it. And I started playing mandolin when I was 8. It was actually this Gibson right here that my dad taught me on and then later gave to me. And I started playing then, and I would often give up and shove it away because I didn't think it was anything anybody wanted to hear, forgetting that it was something the Lord wanted to hear. And he'd come along and say, get your harp down out of the willow. And that's how that was. And I would echo those words to all of us. Get your harp out of the willow and worship the Lord. Because if the Lord doesn't tell us our worship's bad, who else has a right to tell us our worship is bad? So I want to end with a story. I can't say it's true. It's just a neat story I heard, and it's an old story. It's been going on, bounced around for a long time, I imagine. And it's a story about a minstrel, and he used to play a lute, and he was the most marvelous. This one minstrel became the royal musician, and he played for the king, and he played beautifully. He was the best minstrel ever, and everybody would come from all over to hear this man play the lute. And one day the king, in his wisdom, said, I'd like to hear the man who taught you to play the lute play it. And the minstrel said, well, we can do that. He lives a long way. It's a 3-day journey, and he lives in the wilderness in a cave. But we could go there, and I could ask him, and I'm sure he'd play and let you hear him. And so they did. They created this royal caravan, and out across through the wilderness and so on and so forth. They traveled 3 days journey, and they get out there, and there, lo and behold, like the minstrel said, there's a cave. And they go in, and sure enough, there's an old man there that plays the lute, and he was the master that taught the royal musician. And so the king explained himself and said, I wanted to hear you play. And so he did. He played his lute. And he played beautifully. And the entire court that had traveled there with the king was amazed at the sound of the music that came out of that old man's lute, his instrument. And as they were leaving, the king asked the royal musician, he said, I don't understand. He played the same instrument as you. He played it the same way as you. He played the same arrangements and the same notes as you. But he sounds so much better. And the royal musician said, that's easy. It's because he plays for God, and I only play for kings. And I think that story tells us a lot about worship. That you can play for man, or you can play for the Lord. You can sing to those around you while you're worshiping, or you can sing to the Lord. And it isn't music that qualifies worship. It's worship that qualifies music. And we get that backwards in our world. That we think that the better our music is, the better our worship is. But in God's kingdom, the better our worship is, the better our music is. So as we open up Holy Week, and we'll be doing some of these each night. This was a little longer than I'd hoped, but I'm going to keep at it. We're going to be talking each night. This is Monday, Holy Monday. Tomorrow we'll be talking about a different topic on Holy Week. God bless you, and have a good Holy Week.